The eye of the peasant sees only the most apparent characteristics of the local overlord. The peasant's understanding of his overlord knows nothing of his historical attitude. This may be seen 1,000 times. The Battle of Bannockburn was not won by the Scots alone, but by a greatly mixed multitude, of which they formed a part. Many of the leaders were, no doubt, Scots. The more distinguished were chiefly non-Scottish, and none among them, of whatever race, excelled the famous Scot, the Black Dubhglas. He belonged to the oldest sept of his clan, known as the Black Dubhlases, a term which proves to be tautological when analysed, since Dubhglas signifies the black swarthy man. Their origin is shadowy, but one tradition states that the first of the family distinguished himself by his bravery, in a battle against Donald the White, a Norseman of the 8th century. From this half-mythical figure, down to the good Sir James who fought at Bannockburn, there is a fall of nearly 600 years. Time enough for any amount of changes in the race of the Dubhlases. There's no doubt, the chiefs of the Black Dubhlas tribe were styled the Black Dubhlas because of their dusky skins. Wherever you encounter the Black Dubhlas in history or tradition, you find that he is a black man. At least several of the chiefs' Black Dubhlas clan were themselves black-skinned men. They would not be black for very long after the period they begin to appear in history as veritable flesh and blood. Their first authentic appearances coincide with the time when the barrier between black and white had been broken down in many places, and the two opposite types had greatly intermingled. This movement is seen in their own history, which tells of intercourse, political and matrimonial, between them and such white races as the Normans and the Flemings. Eventually, this tendency resulted in the disappearance of the pure Black Dubhlases from place and power. The last of them was James, the 9th Earl, whose tribal sceptre was swayed by the chiefs of the half-blood offshoot known as the Red Douglases. The 8th Lord of this terrible family is thus oddly sketched by MacTaggart in his Galloway book, Black Dubhglas. Perhaps the greatest villain ever known in Galloway. His den was the castle of Thrave, a befitting keep for the tiger. He kept the country round him in awe for many a day. Even the Scottish kings could make nothing of him. This Dubhglas was stabbed by King James at Stirling, in 1452. 2 years after the death of this earl, his brother, the last lord, was confronting the army of King James in the open field. The king's army had laid siege to one of the Dubhglas castles, Abercorn. Dubhglas himself had marched an army of 40,000 men to raise the siege, when suddenly, he found himself one morning deserted by all his vassal lords, and their forces. Either by dissension and jealousy, or by the diplomacy of the royal party, the Dubhglas defenders went over in a body to the king. The last Dubhglas appears to have fled southward into Annandale, where he lurked until the following spring of 1455. In the meantime, his brothers, the Earls of Murray and Ormond, headed the other sections of the Black Dubhglas Confederacy. They offered a determined resistance to the king, but their army was completely crushed in the May of 1455. Their former owners slain on the battlefield, the Dubhglas castles were besieged and reduced, and finally, with the Dubhglas estates forfeited, the main body of the race was overthrown forever. The Dubhlases themselves were a gang of black, marauding Moors, or Gypsies, certainly on an extensive scale. So extensive, indeed, that the injured king might well put a heavy price upon the head of their leader, dead or alive. Although the titular head of the Black Dubhglas sept, the last earl, had inherited some share of the white Norman blood, and, consequently, a Moor's head crest would not have been a wholly appropriate emblem had his been the head that MacLellan brought to the king. The aristocracy of this race were great nobles, possessed of lands and dignities in France as well as in their own country, were the leading figures in Scotland for several generations, and almost occupied the throne of Scotland. Therefore, to a certain section of the peasantry of Galloway, presumably of white blood, the Black Douglas was simply a swarthy tyrant, like the black oppressor of Welsh tradition. How did the Moor become a gypsy in Scotland and England anyway? In the diction of the past, a black man was a Moor, so that when the Black Douglas and his brothers, with others of their tribe, had retreated to the wilds of Annandale after the defection of their allies, by 1455, they were virtually a band of marauding gypsies, or Moors, as the legend of the MacLellans testifies. They had been utterly discomfited. Their power, and position in the country, was gone forever. From that time forward, they were outlaws, and rebels, cut up into separate bands, left lurking in the mountains. Their days as a political power in the country, or as nobles under a semi-Norman monarchy, had come to an end. It was precisely at this point in time, when the last vestige of Pictish, or Moorish power, had crumbled away, and the last representatives of Moorish nobility had sunk into the position of hunted bandits and outlaws, that the gypsies of Galloway make their appearance. From that date onward, a Black Douglas was the equivalent of a gypsy.